Welcome to Nerd. My name is Veronica and today I want to talk about this book, The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters, that I've been reading for Black History Month on my office. My office organized a Black History Month book club and this was the pick. I apologize if I sound a little bit off. I've been down with a really bad flu for 4 days and I want to distract myself from how garbage I feel, so I want to talk about books. So for starters, very pretty cover, and it's also that like really soft kind of matte feeling to it, so it's very nice to hold. However, the backside is full of just quote from authors and just a comparison. They compare it to Game of Thrones meets Gladiator, which I will get into it. But yeah, the only description on this page, like on this cover, this book, that is about this story is these 3 lines here at the top. A world caught in an internal war, one young man will become his people's only hope for survival. That's all you get, and it is annoying me to no end. I hate it when people do this. Like, I'm picking up a book, I want to read the book, I want to know what the book is about, not if some author that probably didn't even read it wrote an excerpt because their assistant read the book for them. I personally don't really read the quotes. I don't think that they are important or have any value to my experience with the book. I'm not picking up a book based on some author's quote. Like, can we stop? Like, you have one there, one there, one there, 3 on this side, 3 on this side. That's too many, especially because you don't tell me what the plot is. Ugh. And I know that this is a publisher decision, and this is not something that the author, Evan Winters, most likely had any input or influence on. Because there's not even, it's not even a summary, there's not a summary even inside this book. You expect that if you don't have anything on the book outside that tells you about the story, you're like, okay, but then on the first page it should be something, right? No. The first page here is a piece of the prologue, which takes place about 200 years ahead of the actual story. So it gives me nothing about what's in this actual book. That frustrates me. I'm like, do better. I will say I will not be continuing this series because of the things that we're gonna get into. Let's start with the negatives before we go into the positives, because I want to end on a better note. Let's start with the biggest gripe that I have, and it is the comparison thing. I hate comparisons. It introduces expectations in your head that no matter what you do, you cannot achieve. Because this book is not Game of Thrones or Gladiator, because Gladiator and Game of Thrones is their own things. They are successful for their own reasons. This needs to be successful for its own reason, and I think that it could have been. It could so have been, because the overarching plot that is going on here in the big one, I can see the one that is big for the entire series. I believe he said it was going to be 4 books. It is an interesting thing. However, I don't know if you can see that here. From this to this is technically just him training and getting better. And I mean down to the details of he hit his shoulder and then he sliced on his calf. He took a hit on his shoulder and rolled over and then jumped up and blocked a hit. Like, to that level. That is essentially between these 2. If I'm being kind, it's between this one and this one, not this one. However, if I'm not being kind, it's the entire thing. That's too much. That's too much. If you like that level of detail in your fighting, this book is for you. I swear, this book is for you. And because I'm not that interested in it, it wasn't for me. I hate to say it, but that was a big quit point for me. The only reason why I actually finished this was for the book club. And that's the main issue for me. So, it is not to say that it was a shit book or anything. No, it's just not for me. If you want that level of detailed fighting, combat stuff, pick it up. If you don't, I wouldn't recommend this to you, because it shouldn't In my opinion, as someone who has been reading fantasy exclusively for years, this much of a book should not be that detailed. That is essentially, we're reading the training montage that is being skipped over in films or shortened down to like a 30-second thing. That's what we've been reading. And I'm sorry, I hate it. Like, it was okay, I get it. Can we get to the plot? Can we get there? Because it started, the first 150 pages, really solid, really good. I was really excited. And then we hit, I counted, it was like 287 pages of just training, skirmishes, fighting, training, skirmishes, fighting, over and over and over again. It's like, even if I'm being generous and I say 200 pages, that's still too much. So there was a really big slog in the middle, and then we get to the last 150 pages, and then the story picks up again, and I'm like, this is exciting, this is good. The reason why I won't continue this series is not because, like, yeah, the final story caught me, but I cannot get behind, I cannot trust that the rest of the books won't be the same kind of focus on this and then stabbing here and then slicing there and then rolling over here. It's not for me. I really can't, even if the overarching story that we got towards the end is really interesting. But the comparison, like, I cannot see Game of Thrones in this. So coming with the comparison Gladiator and Game of Thrones is not helpful at all. It is setting yourself up to failure. And I think that, so that's why I hate comparisons. I get why people started doing this to like find their audience, and you know how you say, oh, I have this trope, or I have this trope. And then, like, I get it, but it's done to death. It's like, move on, get over it, because this book did not have anything of Game of Thrones level. When people say Game of Thrones, I'm not thinking, oh, it has dragons, and that's what makes it Game of Thrones-y. Game of Thrones has political intrigue front and center. It's not about the big battles. It's about the underhanded, the deals, the political stuff, and the shifting of power. That's what makes Game of Thrones Game of Thrones. This book does not have that. It is something that is happening. You can figure out that stuff is happening behind the scenes, but it's not something that impacts the main character. It's nothing that influences the main character until the last 100 pages, and I might be very generous with 100 pages. This is where I'm gonna pause and bring in a quote from the author during the call, because we kind of asked, like, who is this for? And he said, like, yeah, the comparison is Game of Thrones Gladiator. I could also say it's more of a Bronze Age Africa John Wick. And I was like, that is a good one. That's what you should have used instead. Bronze Age African inspired world, John Wick. That I believe. There's a lot of gore, a lot of death in this. I thought when he said that, I was like, that would have been good. That I could get behind. Because bringing in Game of Thrones, not only did it disappoint, I want to be clear, when I say disappoint, the book did not disappoint because the story it was telling, it made sense that the political stuff didn't come in until the end, basically. And even then, it was fighting. The main character is not involved in anything that has to do with political stuff. He just happens to be in the correct place, and he is just fighting. He's not doing anything political. So bringing in Game of Thrones set up expectations that it did not fulfill. But on top of that, because of how this vengeance story is written, it just further connects my brain to Game of Thrones and say, oh, we're reading Arya's story, but it's a black boy as the main character instead. It's like even down to repeating the names of the people that she had to kill literally happens in this. It was very cringe, but so yes, comparing it to Game of Thrones and bringing that to my mind already made this connection a lot easier to make, and I don't think that was a good move on the publisher side. But moving on. Now, this book was sold to me as being a African mythology inspired world, which was a little bit incorrect. It's not African mythology, it is African inspired setting. It's not really based on any African mythology, it's more based on a Bronze Age Africa, and specifically Zimbabwe. Their entire society is built on military, like it's fighting, they're soldiers, that is their entire society. They have an extremely strict caste system, which rubs me the wrong way, but I think that's the point. All the commons are referred to as lesser, and they're very much always reinforced that they are of less value, they are weaker, they are second-class citizens, etc. So there is a sub-story, subtext, whatever you want to call it in this case, of kind of fighting against that. I personally didn't necessarily feel like they achieved it in the story because of how the main character behaves. Now, let's get into the main character. The main character's name is Tao, and he is, as said, of the lower caste, and his father is pretty much as high as you can get in their military society for which caste he was born into. So he is a swordmaster. He's been teaching Tao from when he was young, blah, blah, blah. I'm gonna try not to spoil too much stuff. This is something you learned like in the first chapter. Tao is kind of written as this very pacifist, doesn't really want to do the fighting, doesn't want to sacrifice his life to the war machine, because everyone knows that the lessers are essentially cannon fodder. So he has this plan because he's in love with a girl from the town. It was really cute. They had their first kiss in the first 100 pages, and it was very like teenage awkward. So very well written in that regard. But he wants to kind of essentially get injured enough that he can't be sent to the front, but still be of enough value to get a high position in their local, their fiefs, leadership stuff, whatever. Perfect. And that's his plan. That's how he is as a character. He is not really invested in the fighting, blah, blah, blah. He's just like, I want to marry her and have a good life kind of thing. So that's the kind of character we start out with, the 150 pages. Then the inciting incident happens, which is his father gets murdered. It is complex, but it is essentially main character's fault because of the caste system and the strict rules and not being allowed to touch a noble. I'm keeping it vague on purpose so that I don't spoil too much. But that is the inciting incident. Personally, I felt that was pretty obvious, so I don't feel like that's too much of a spoiler. And then that character just flips. And personally, I don't buy it. Like, I didn't really feel like I understood why he suddenly flipped from one chapter to another. He goes from having this very pacifistic tendency, wanting this life, and then just going like full on vengeance. I get grief can do things to people, but because he was leaning so much in the pacifistic tendencies that he just went like 180, was a little bit not believable. In my opinion, it would have made more sense if he already had the mentality of like, yeah, I'm alone, I'm into the whole what our society is built on, and then tip over. I would have found that step a lot more believable than this extreme change, because it's very unlikely for that big of a shift to happen in any human. Like, a bit of a hesitation would have been nice to see, that it's a grief thing that he's doing that making him react this way. But we never really got anything that indicated any sort of hesitation on the path he is in. No, he was just like, these 3 names, I'm gonna kill them. And that's my life now. Like, he's completely letting go of the girl. He then later finds out that she is now an important figure in the world because she can use magic. I didn't find it very believable. I didn't really get behind his character. Speaking of characters, we have a lot of characters in this story, and none of them matter. Literally, none of them matter. We have Tao, the main character. We have Zuri, who is the love interest. And those two are the only characters that really got any sort of character establishment. Like, those are the only 2 characters I can say that I have a feel for and understand and know who they are and what they stand for and what they're going through. None of the other characters really truly were given the time and space to make me connect with them, for me to understand them. There's 5 characters that are supposed to be this military group, the school that he's now in, the top pupils kind of thing. And it is the main character, and then there's 4 other boys. And their defining characteristics that I can only tell you is, one is smart, he's the strategist. One is big and strong. One coughs a lot. And one has a name. Like, I do not know anything other about them. Nothing about their philosophy, nothing about their struggles, nothing about why they want to do something, why are they so invested and why are they so good. Nothing. That is essentially all I know. The big strong guy can also not speak in full sentences. He's just like, look, stand up, go there, fight. It's just like, all other characters are wafer thin cardboard. And that's something that I really, really didn't like about this book, because there's so much opportunity to create a more colorful world and cast that you can actually feel that when we get to the end parts of the book and one of these 5 dies, I felt nothing. There was no importance. There was nothing that, like, we're told that they have this grief or something, that they have like, no. And I'm just like, I don't see it. Like, I do not connect, because you have not established this character that dies. And because they are so wafer thin and cardboard, I don't feel like it's a bad, like, I'm spoiling something, because clearly the character wasn't of importance. I think the low characterization, establishment of characters is this book's main weakness, because even the main character I am not invested in. Because of the way the story was written and what we focus on, I don't feel like I need to focus on his character. I'm just following along a Gary Stu character getting stronger and stronger and being able to do things that no one else has been able to do, because everyone else goes mad if they do what he's doing. And it's just like, how do I say it? It's like the chosen trope, but without the magical aspect of it, being the chosen one, you know, born to prophecy or something. Nothing like that. But it's definitely giving the chosen trope vibes. He has no indication as to why he should be able to best them, and then his mental fortitude is miles better than the best trained soldier, and they are like scared of him. And even the evil people in this book, they have this, we get a chapter from one of their main fighters that has this, she's legendary, right? And she runs away from him, even though when she's like 3 times his size and has magical backing. It's just like, it does not make sense. Everything in this book just sets everything about him up to, you're the greatest, you're the best, you're the fiercest, you're the strongest, you're the amazingest, all of that stuff. Like, and it's just like, it gets annoying to a certain point, because it's like, we get it. You're the best, you're the brightest, you're the most handsomest, move on. Can we get to the actual story? So that frustrated me with this book. Actually, there is one more thing I want to add to the negative side, or maybe it's more neutral, but it frustrated me because I was so excited looking forward to this, as the story was very much marketed as this African-inspired world and African mythology, of all of that stuff. One of the people at the book club asked, like, hey, people who are used to fantasy, there was several people who this was the first experience with fantasy, which was very interesting to hear their thoughts on it. But they asked, like, if you're used to fantasy, did this world stand out to you? Was there anything different? And another person said, like, no, it's essentially the standard fantasy world with just a fresh coat of paint. And unfortunately, I have to agree. There was nothing really separating this world other than that the characters were black, that separated them from any other fantasy story or fantasy world, I should say. And that was very disappointing, because I was looking forward to getting something new and fresh and like exciting and learning more about like different cultural expressions and everything. But we didn't get any of that, unfortunately. And I found that very sad. I was so excited. I came in with a little bit too high of hopes in that regard, I think. But if you have any suggestion where we actually explore African mythology or cultures, like in a fantasy setting where you can feel that inspiration a little bit more, please drop them down below, because I was so excited and now I feel kind of let down. So please drop them down below. I'm looking forward to something new, because I agree. Fantasy has almost universally been very Eurocentric, and it's boring. It's just boring. Like it's so predictable. So yes, please drop any and all non-Eurocentric fantasy stories down below and I will check them out, because I really wanted something new. And now we come to the good part, the positive side. So one thing I will say is that the writing is very solid. Like Evan Winter in this book proves that he has a very good grasp of the craft. There was no point that really drew me out of the story because the writing was clunky or awkward or anything. It is a very solid, crafted book. And that is why, even though I will not be continuing this series, I am definitely going to keep an eye out for his next series and see if that might speak to me a little bit more. Because I can tell he's a good writer. His focus on the specific combat moves is not really my thing. But if his next series is slightly different and don't really linger on that as much, I think I would love his books. Because the story, the overarching story that you have is very promising. It is interesting, it has complexities, but you just get that in the past, like last 100 pages. And that bothers me, because this book is almost 600 pages. It did not need to be 600 pages. 400-page high fantasy book is still really good length. This book, in my personal opinion, should have been shorted down, because the good writing you have in the beginning and the good writing you have at the end is confusing when the middle is such a slog. I'm sorry to say it, but it is a slog, specifically to me. Now, what I will say also here on the positive side is that kind of in those 250 pages, you have a few pages where you get a little bit more world building. And I love world building, as I've said before. And it is, I actually have one little note down here where we get the love interest talking about the creation story of the world. And I love when authors include this, because this is like a cornerstone of like cultural views on how the world order is. And something that was said in this creation stories, I should probably make a whole video on that because it's so interesting. In the creation myth, there is a line. Like the whole creation myth supports the caste system, which made me very interested in learning whether or not the creation story that they are taught is something that has been created by the nobles in order to maintain power, or if this is genuinely the creation story that started their from before they arrived in this land. There's a quote here. "He held his jealousy in check for a time, but as the eons slipped by, his hate for being less than his betters did not subside." And I was like, oh, that's a good line. Like, does that mean that this whole society is built on the concept or the ideology that certain people born based on who they're born to are inherently more valuable than others? Or is this a story that has been rewritten and created by the nobles in order to maintain power? And that's where, world building, I love world building. That's where it comes from. Like, my love for it is that you can play with these things so much that, yes, here's a creation story, and readers have a tendency, calling out readers here, have a tendency to assume that every information they are fed is 100% correct. But you as an author can always play with that, because this creation story, creation myth, is told to the love interest by people in power, who then tells it to the main character. So it is not 100% correct. This is unreliable narrator at its finest. But you, like, a lot of readers just take it at face value and like, okay, so that's how everything came to be. But it's just like, no, like, this was a very specific line, like, a jealousy about being less than his betters. Like, that also gives me, like, the bad guy in this universal creation thing is like, I mean, I can kind of relate to that. Because, like, no one is better than anyone else, right? So my idealistic way is coming in here. But so that was very, very interesting. And when I read that, I was like, oh, I'm so interested. That was so good. I never was able to actually ask the author about that specific thing. We had so many questions going around that unfortunately not. So I'm just going to assume that that little detail there is something that reflects the caste system and is reinforced by the nobles, and that this might not be how the world actually came to be the way it is, because that's much more interesting. So the prologue essentially starts with them arriving in the land that the story takes place in. They had to flee their homeland because the Kol, which were silverskins, so I'm assuming white people, pushed them out of their land. And they arrive in this land. That's where the prologue starts. And oh my god, by the way, the prologue, so good. Which made reading the rest of the story less enjoyable, because you start on such a high note with the prologue, and I was so excited. You have the super queen that is like, okay, fine, see me as a monster who like used a dragon and everything, and then you get to this little boy that has nothing, and we're supposed to get behind a vengeance story when we started on such a high note. What? Like, I would have loved to read that story, like the prologue. If the rest of the story was following the prologue, like with that character and that whole thing, I would have loved reading that, because that was such a promising story. And then the rest of the story just felt like it fell short because we started on such a strong high note. And logically, I know that this kind of thing can come into play in the later books, but it was so good. I got so hyped. And a book that is called Rage of Dragons, and there's only 3 instances of dragons, and they are never really a main thing. It's just like, I was so hyped for it. I was so hyped. Dragons, different than Eurocentric kind of world building. You know? Oh, I would have, it was, I'm going to be doing a little bit spoiling here, because otherwise the positive side is going to be very short. But if you don't want to get spoiled, jump to this time. For the rest of you, hi. So as we said, Rage of Dragons, right? There is this whole thing that the dragons in this world is called guardians, and people view them as there for their protection. But as we learn in the later half of the book, that's not really the case. The chosen people, his people, the main character's people, are holding a baby dragon capture. And they are like keeping it captured in order to be able to mimic a baby dragon's scream or call that attracts the adult dragons to come and do their bidding for them. And then in retaliation, when they realize like the baby isn't here, they kill one of the people that called for it in the first place. So every time they call for a dragon, one of the people, the women who can do magic, because it's only women who can do magic here, that they die. So I found that aspect of it to be really interesting, to really like turning it on its head, that we're like, I kind of saw it from the beginning in the sense that I personally don't jive with how this society is built, how they kind of frame themselves as being chosen, we're better, we're above. Someone said it in the book club actually, now that I remember. It's very strong colonizer vibes to the main character's people. And I think that that's framing it very well. I don't jive with the caste system. I don't jive with the ideology. It very much makes me feel ugh. Then showing and twisting it and like, yeah, actually they are holding a baby dragon capture in order to control dragons. And it's just like, you are not as like a good people in that regard. Like you're trying to survive and you have justification for certain things, and then you do this and everything, right? And it's very interesting. I found that was a very good part of the book, that we actually did get some sort of twist, change of like having the main character specifically face the bad parts of his people, and the rest are back. Hello. Let's move into the section where we had a little bit of a sit me down with the Winter himself, the author himself, Evan Winter. And he said some really interesting stuff that for me gave a little bit more perspective, not necessarily on the story, but on the world building and how he approaches writing, which I found very interesting. So to start with, this book is based on / inspired, let's see what he said, based on Bronze Age Africa, but it is a secondary world, so it's not set in our world. And it has exclusively Black characters. And I asked him who he perceived as the main audience, target audience for this book. And I'll be honest, it doesn't sound like he has necessarily figured out how to make it, like what his target audience is, which is fine. It is one of the more difficult ones to do. He basically said fans of epic high fantasy. And I'm like, that is not, that's not specific enough. I am a fan of epic high fantasy, and this was not for me. So what I would say, what I would recommend this to is for people who like a lot of fighting scenes. The focus is on the fighting and the learning, but not so much on the big overarching world-ending plot kind of thing that you tend to get with epic high fantasy. This book is not for everyone who likes epic high fantasy, is essentially what I'm trying to say. Like I said in the beginning, I think a Bronze Age John Wick is a much better description of it. So if you like John Wick and you want a high fantasy version of that, I believe that that's a closer representation of what this book is. A question got asked about what he was trying to achieve with the setting, whether or not, how much mythology was part of it, what inspiration he drew from, etc. And he was very candid and said that he didn't draw from any one mythology, and he was, quote, looking to capture a sense of place and perhaps time that felt very important for me to tell, end quote. Earlier in the video, I mentioned something about the chosen trope, and while I personally am quite done with it, it's overdone for me, it's just boring, it's very predictable, it's just like, why does everyone have to be the best, being able to do everything kind of thing? I prefer it when it's like a cast, where you have 3 or 5 people that have their different skills and they work well together and they balance each other out. I am very tired where there's one character who can do it all. But something that struck me while I was writing out my final notes for this book was that I have seen myself, in the regards I've seen white characters be the chosen one over and over and over again, and therefore been very, I'm done with it. However, because having more Black main characters, or Latinx, Asian, whatever you want to, minority as the main character, this might be among the first time in the book space history where they can see themselves as the chosen one and have that feeling of, you know what, I can be that. I can be the chosen one. I can do anything. I can do everything. So I caught myself thinking about that, and I found that to be a potentially very interesting aspect of why we should give space to those types of stories, even though we might have been it's been told over and over again. But here we have the potential that a young Black boy, or a girl for that matter, that can see themselves being the chosen one and I can do it all, I can be the chosen one, I can be the best person, and all of that stuff that I, as a white person, have been able to see myself in, yes, most of them tend to be boys, and women are like, or women and girls are raised having to be able to center men in everything. So yes, there is that whole aspect, but as a whole, there are a lot more white female characters that have been part of the chosen trope, as opposed to any Black, Asian, Latin characters at all. So I think that is something to be able to keep in mind and give space for, that these stories are still needed, even if they're not for you. So I just wanted to make that note, that I think that while this story wasn't for me, I do think that it could be a very interesting story for a young boy to read. That was something that I thought could be a good thing to bring up, because it is something that we should be conscious about. There is this thing, help me out here. Okay, earlier this year with the Stuff Your Kindle or e-reader day, you know, I was looking through everything and I got to the fantasy section. And there was a lot of books there, sure, but then there had a separate list that were fantasy by Black authors. And I was like, I was confused. Okay, we're trying to normalize, right? So that it's all equal. But why are they separated still? Because these books, having a list of Black authors so that you know, have that exposure, one thing. But I personally very much think that their books and their names should also be in just fantasy. So you have them in the fantasy list because that's what they are. They're authors of fantasy. And then you have a list of like, hey, but if you want to specifically read by Black authors, here's another list with those names included in there. So I had a conversation with my partner about that. I was like, but isn't that contradicting what we're trying to do? Because they are writing fantasy, so why are they not part of, you know, the main fantasy list? Why are we separating them as if that's a different type of fantasy? Because they're still writing fantasy, they just happen to be Black authors, maybe Black characters. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? Like, it confused me a little bit. I just wanted to add that in because it just popped into my head again speaking about this. So let me know down below what your thoughts is. What is my final verdict, you may ask? Well, it is 3 stars. I think that this book, if it had hit the right target audience, I think it could be an easy 4, maybe even 5 star for someone, but it's not for me. So 3 stars with the addendum that I am going to keep a very close eye on Evan Winter, because his writing, his craft is very strong, very solid, and what I got to see at the end there with you know, the overarch world plot was very interesting. So he definitely has a good, interesting grasp of storytelling. This series is not something that I'm going to continue because it's just not for me, but maybe his next one, if he just lowers the stab there, block there, swipe over here, like the level of detail in that, if he stops that, I think that I would really love him as an author. Thank you very much for being here. If you like this type of content, make sure to hit subscribe. Otherwise, I hope that you have a good day, night, wherever you are in the time stream, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!